The room was quiet, almost too quiet. Shadows covered the walls of the small chamber. In the middle of the room stood a cradle, old and made of carved stone, its surface shining faintly under the dim light. But the cradle was empty. No child slept inside. No soft breath filled the air. Still, the mother sat beside it, her hands resting on the edges, her voice soft as she sang an old lullaby. Her name was Celira, and she was a mother without a child. Her people had told her to stop singing, to stop hoping. They said her daughter was gone, taken during the raid, lost forever. But Celira's heart refused to believe it. Every night she returned to the cradle. Every night she sang, her voice shaking, her eyes full of tears. The song was slow, the kind sung only by mothers. It was a song of comfort, a song to protect. Her voice trembled, but she never stopped. The melody carried through the cold air of the chamber. Sometimes neighbors heard it and turned away, whispering to each other. "She has lost her mind," they said. "She sings to nothing." But Celira did not care. She sang because deep inside she felt her daughter could still hear her. Wherever she was outside, the world was not kind. Her planet had been scarred by war, its skies often filled with smoke from enemy ships. The streets carried the silence of fear, and the memory of screams from the last attack was still fresh. Celira's people had seen too many losses, too many cradles left empty. They had learned to bury their hope quickly. But Celira's heart was different. Hope was the only thing keeping her alive. She remembered the night of the raid, the alarm screaming, the sky torn apart by fire. She had run to her daughter's room, only to find strange soldiers there, their faces hidden, their hands reaching for the child. Celira had fought. She had screamed. Her claws had scratched against metal armor, but they were stronger, faster. They had taken her baby, and with one strike they had thrown Celira aside. By the time she woke again, the cradle was already empty. That night still burned inside her mind. Every detail cut her heart like a blade. The sound of her baby's cry being carried away haunted her sleep, and so she sang. She sang not only for the child who was gone, but also for the memory she refused to let die. The cradle creaked gently as she rocked it with her hand. Her voice filled the silence of the room. The words of the lullaby spoke of safe journeys, of a mother's arms protecting from harm. Tears slid down her face as she sang. Her people called it madness, but to her it was survival. Sometimes she imagined she could hear a small laugh, a soft breath, a tiny hand reaching up from the cradle. Sometimes the shadows tricked her eyes and she saw the outline of her daughter lying there. But when she blinked, the cradle was always empty again. Still, she refused to stop. Her heart told her that if she sang, her baby might find the way back. Perhaps her daughter would hear her voice across the stars. Perhaps someone would hear and return her. She did not know how, she only knew she must believe. The days passed slowly, each one the same. The world outside grew darker, filled with fear and silence. But Celira's voice was the only light left in her home. The song became a ritual, a promise. The cradle was not just wood and stone. It was the last piece of her child she could hold. And so she guarded it as if one day it would no longer be empty. Others pitied her, some avoided her, some mocked her, but at night, when the wind carried her voice through the streets, even the hardest hearts felt something stir inside. Her song was full of grief, but also of hope. It carried a question into the air. What if the child was not truly gone? On this night, Celira's song was softer than usual, almost like a whisper. Her hands shook as she touched the cradle. Her tears fell again, glistening under the pale light. But then she paused. Something was different. For the first time, she felt a presence near the door. Her ears caught the faint sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, not like her people's. Her song broke in the middle of a note. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was it a thief, another soldier, or just her imagination? The air grew colder. The shadows stretched longer. Celira's voice fell silent, and for the first time in many nights, the cradle was still. Her eyes turned toward the door, waiting, fearing, hoping, and then the handle moved. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Not one of her people, not one of the soldiers. It was something she had never seen before. A human, and in his arms he carried something small, something wrapped in cloth. Celira's breath caught in her throat. Her heart froze, her eyes locked onto the bundle. For one moment she forgot her fear. For one moment the world stood still because the bundle moved. And from inside came the soft sound of a baby's cry. The planet of Celira's people was not like Earth. Its skies were heavy with violet clouds and the sun burned faint red across the horizon. Tall spires of crystal grew out of the ground like forests, glowing faintly at night. Rivers of silver water cut through the valleys, their surface always shining as if made of liquid light. It was a world of beauty but also of scars, because under those skies lived people who had forgotten peace. Celira's people were called the Cathari. They were tall, their skin patterned with faint silver lines that glowed when they were strong in spirit. Once long ago the Cathari had been proud, builders of cities and singers of great songs, but now their songs were mostly laments. The wars had taken too much. Generations had grown under the shadow of stronger empires. Their voices had grown quiet, their hearts weaker with every loss. Celira walked through the streets of her city, the air filled with silence around her. The walls of broken towers leaned toward the ground. Children played quietly, not with laughter but with cautious glances toward the sky. Every family had lost someone. Every home carried an empty space where once there was joy. And yet life went on. The market still opened. The traders still called. But their voices lacked the fire of hope. It was survival, not living. When Celira passed, others looked at her with pity. They whispered about the mother who still sang to an empty cradle. Some shook their heads, others simply turned away. For them, the story was over, but Celira held on. She knew something they did not. Her heart told her her child was still alive. And though her people said it was madness, she believed. Above their city floated the black shapes of warships. The enemy kept them always in sight. A reminder of who ruled the skies, these ships belonged to the Therics, a species feared across many systems. The Therics were merciless, taking what they wanted, destroying what they could not own when they raided. They did not always come for treasure. Sometimes they came for children. The reason was never spoken, but the whispers said experiments, soldiers, or simply cruelty. This was why Celira's people no longer fought. They were too afraid to lose more, but not all were afraid. There were still whispers of rebellion, small groups that met in secret. Celira sometimes heard the rumors when she went to fetch water or buy food. A stranger would murmur about weapons hidden underground, about voices rising again. But these were only whispers, never actions, because the Cathari had learned that every attempt to fight back ended with more bodies in the streets. On this day, Celira returned from the market with little food. She walked past the temple, its grand pillars cracked and broken. Once the temple had been a place of song, where voices rose together, now it stood silent. Only wind moving through the broken arches. Celira paused, looking at the carvings of mothers and children etched into the stone. Her heart ached, but she touched the wall and whispered a promise. "I will not give up," she said, though no one else could hear. The people of the city thought survival was enough. But Celira wanted more. She wanted her daughter, her song, her family whole again. She wanted to believe the stories that sometimes reached her ears. Stories about strange outsiders, about fragile creatures who had entered the galaxy not long ago. They were called humans. Most Cathari laughed at the idea of them, calling them weak and foolish, but Celira did not laugh. Something inside her stirred whenever she heard the name. The humans were said to be stubborn, reckless and filled with fire, unlike the Cathari. They did not let go of hope so easily. Some said they fought even when the battle was already lost. Some said they protected children not only of their own kind, but of others too. Celira did not know if the stories were true, but she wanted them to be true, because she had seen enough of her own people's despair. Maybe it was time for a different kind of fire to arrive. That night, she returned to her chamber and lit the small lamp beside the cradle. The room glowed faintly, shadows stretching long across the walls. She placed her hand gently on the cradle, feeling the cold surface of the stone. Again she began to sing, her voice trembling. Her song filled the small space, rising and falling like waves on a distant sea. But this time she sang not only to her daughter. She sang to the stars, she sang to the unknown, to whatever might be listening. And deep in her heart, she hoped that if the humans were real, they would hear far above. The sky rumbled, thunder rolling across the violet clouds. The people in the streets hurried inside, afraid of storms and raids, but Celira stayed by the cradle, her song rising against the silence. Her voice was no longer only sorrow. It carried something else, something her people had forgotten. It carried defiance. The cradle rocked slowly under her hand. Her tears fell as they always did. But behind the tears there was strength. Her people might have given up, but she had not. and as the storm rolled above, the sound of her voice carried further than before. Carried past the broken city, past the empty fields. Carried into the night where perhaps someone, somewhere, might be listening. The storm passed by morning, leaving the sky painted in streaks of red and violet. The air smelled of ash and whetstone, a reminder that even the weather on this planet carried scars. Celira stood outside her home, her hands clutching her shawl tight against the cold wind. Around her the city was waking, though not with joy. Merchants opened their stalls with tired movements. Children moved quietly to fetch water, and guards patrolled the streets with hollow eyes. Life continued, but without spirit. As Celira walked through the marketplace, she noticed the whispers. Two traders leaned close, speaking in hushed voices, their eyes darting around as if afraid. The words carried just enough for her to hear. "They say the humans have landed," one murmured. "They say they fought the Therics and survived," the other replied, his tone more disbelief than hope. Celira's heart skipped a beat. The word was unfamiliar on her tongue, yet powerful in her ears, humans. She had heard fragments before, little more than stories that came through traveling merchants, strange creatures, soft and fragile. From a distant blue world, many dismissed the tales as lies, or at best exaggerations meant to entertain. But Celira felt something stir deep inside when she heard the name spoken. Perhaps because she wanted to believe in something beyond despair. Later that day, she visited the well. Here too the whispers spread. A group of women filled their jars. Their voices low but urgent. "They are reckless," one said. "They fight with fire even when death is certain." "Fools," another answered. "Strength is nothing against the Therics. The humans will be broken like all the rest." Yet Celira noticed that none of them truly believed their own words. Behind their doubt was a flicker of something dangerous. Hope. That night, Celira sat by the cradle once more. Her voice was soft, her song carrying the same sorrow as always, but now with a strange new edge. As she sang, she thought of the humans. Were they really reckless, fragile, foolish, or were they something else? What kind of beings risked themselves against monsters like the Therics? What kind of creatures would dare when even her own proud people had chosen silence? Days passed and the rumors grew louder. Some said the humans had small ships, yet fought with a spirit that burned brighter than empires. Others claimed they had seen one with their own eyes, a strange figure in armor carrying weapons that spat fire. The guards scoffed at the stories, warning the people not to dream too much, but the whispers would not stop. It was as if the very name humans carried its own power, spreading from ear to ear like sparks in dry grass. Celira's neighbor, an old man named Arak, stopped her one evening. "You should stop singing," he told her, his voice weary. "It will not bring your child back." But then he leaned closer, lowering his tone. "Yet if the rumors are true, if these humans truly fight as they say, perhaps one day your song will be heard by the right ears." Then he walked away, leaving Celira standing in the twilight, her heart beating faster. Her people had once been dreamers, builders of cities that touched the clouds, but now they were shadows of themselves. Celira wondered if perhaps these humans were what the galaxy needed. Not giants of power, not masters of technology, but creatures who still carried something her people had lost. The fire to fight even when the odds were against them. She began to imagine them as she sang. Not clearly, for she had never seen one, but she pictured beings with fierce eyes, beings who would not bow to the Therics. She imagined one standing in the doorway, not to harm but to return what had been stolen. Her voice trembled at the thought, yet she sang louder, her lullaby no longer only sorrow but also a call, as if somewhere out there in the stars, someone might answer one night as she sang. The wind carried voices outside her door. Travelers had arrived, bringing news from far away. Celira quietly opened her window to listen. "They say the humans are strange," one said. "They laugh even in battle, they bleed easily. But they do not stop," another voice added. One carried a child from the ruins of a raid, even though it was not of their kind. They risked everything for a life not their own. Celira froze, her breath catching in her throat. A child? Could it be only a story, or was it something more? Her heart ached as hope swelled dangerously inside her. Could it be her child? For the first time in many moons. Celira's tears were not only of grief, they were of something else. Something brighter, sharper, terrifying, yet beautiful. Hope was dangerous, her people said. But Celira no longer cared. She would sing louder, longer, until her voice reached across the stars if needed. If humans were truly out there, then perhaps one of them would hear, as the night deepened. The stars burned cold and distant in the violet sky. Celira sat by the cradle, her voice strong. Her song carrying into the silence, she no longer sang only to her daughter. She sang to the whispers, to the strangers beyond her world, to the humans she had never seen. And as her voice rose, the cradle creaked softly, as if rocking to a rhythm only it could hear. The night was heavy with silence. The wind pressed against the walls of Celira's home, carrying the scent of dust and storm. She sat by the cradle as always, her voice rising and falling with the old lullaby. Her hands rested on the carved stone, rocking it slowly. Her eyes were closed, her mind lost between memory and hope. But then the air shifted. At first it was small, a sound so faint it could have been the creak of the floor. Celira's voice faltered, her song breaking for a heartbeat. Her ears twitched, catching the rhythm of footsteps outside her door, slow, deliberate, heavier than her people's. Her heart thudded painfully inside her chest. Fear crawled up her spine. But she did not move. Was it a thief, a spy? Another soldier sent to torment her? Or was it something else? The handle of the door moved. The sound was sharp in the silence. Celira's breath caught, her body tensed, her claws sliding forward instinctively. The door opened with a long groan, and the shadows shifted as a figure stepped inside. The room filled with strange energy. Unfamiliar and unsettling, Celira rose to her feet, her body trembling between fear and defiance. Her eyes locked on the figure. It was not Cathari, its shape was smaller, its skin smooth without the silver lines of her people. It wore strange coverings, layers of cloth and armor that bore scratches and burns. Its face was uncovered, pale under the dim lamp, eyes unlike hers, round and filled with something unreadable. It was human. Celira froze, her mind racing. The whispers had spoken of them, fragile yet fierce, reckless yet stubborn. But seeing one with her own eyes was different. The human stood tall in her doorway, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths. He did not carry himself like an enemy, though his hands were scarred and his shoulders heavy with fatigue. But what caught Celira's eyes was not his face, not his stance, it was what he carried in his arms. Wrapped in a bundle of cloth was something small. The shape shifted gently, a soft sound rising from it. Celira's throat closed, her body weak as her legs threatened to give way. Her eyes widened, her breath broken into gasps. A cry, faint but real. A cry she knew better than her own heartbeat. Her child. For a moment, the world stood still. Her vision blurred with tears as she stumbled forward, her claws trembling as she reached out. Her voice cracked. "My daughter," she whispered, though the word was nearly lost in the silence. The human looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. There was no mockery, no cruelty, only something heavy, something gentle. Slowly, carefully, he stepped closer, his arms lifting the bundle as if it were more precious than his own life. Celira's heart screamed with confusion. Why would a human, a stranger, carry her daughter? Why would he risk entering the city of the Cathari? Her people feared humans, distrusted them, called them reckless. And yet here stood one in her doorway, holding what she had lost. Her claws retracted, her arms opened, trembling as she received the bundle from him. The cloth shifted and the tiny face appeared. Her daughter's eyes opened, soft and blinking, her lips trembling with the sound of life. Celira cried out, the sound breaking through her chest like a storm. She pressed her child to her heart, rocking, kissing, weeping. The empty cradle was no longer empty. The human said nothing at first. He stood still, watching as if afraid to disturb the moment. But Celira lifted her tear-streaked face to him, her voice rough. "How?" she asked, her words trembling. The human's lips parted, his voice quiet but strong. "I found her," he said. "I could not leave her." The words were simple, yet they carried weight. He explained slowly in broken phrases how he had been there when the Therics raided, how he had seen the soldiers leave ruins behind, how he had heard the faint cry of a child buried under debris. He had dug with bleeding hands, had carried her across hostile ground, had hidden her through fire and smoke. He had risked everything, not knowing her name, not knowing if she belonged to friend or foe, because she was a child and he could not walk away. Celira's tears flowed harder, her chest filled with emotions she could not name. Her people would never believe this. They would not understand why a fragile human had done what even the strong Cathari would not. But she understood. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment there was no barrier between alien and human, only two beings, bound by a child and the simple truth of what it meant to protect. The cradle rocked gently beside them, no longer empty. The room was filled not only with song but with new silence, a silence heavy with meaning. The human looked tired, his body worn, but his eyes still carried fire. Celira held her daughter close, her voice whispering soft promises. The human lowered himself to sit by the wall, his gaze never leaving the child he had saved. In that moment, Celira knew the whispers were true. Humans were not like the others. They were not weak, not reckless, not foolish. They were dangerous in a different way. They carried a fire that no empire could take. The fire to protect what mattered, even at the cost of everything. The chamber was quiet except for the soft sound of a baby's breath. Celira sat close to the cradle, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughter. Her tears had not yet dried, her body still trembling with the shock of reunion. Across the room, the human rested against the wall, his figure half in shadow, his chest rising and falling with slow exhaustion. For a long time, neither spoke. Celira stared at her child, afraid that if she blinked, the vision would vanish, but finally her eyes turned toward the human. Her voice was low, rough, filled with both gratitude and suspicion. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk so much for her?" The human lifted his head, his eyes tired yet steady. He spoke slowly, choosing words with care, his voice carrying weight though his body looked fragile. "Because she is a child," he said, "and children should not be left behind." The words were simple, but they struck Celira like thunder. Her people had whispered that humans were reckless, that they did not know when to surrender. But perhaps it was not recklessness. Perhaps it was something deeper, something her people had lost long ago. He told her how he had found the baby, the night of the raid, fire across the sky, ruins smoking in the streets. He had heard the faintest cry beneath stone and dust. Others told him to keep moving, to leave the sound behind, but he had refused. He had clawed at the wreckage with his bare hands, blood soaking his fingers until he pulled her free. She was small, fragile, but alive. And in that moment he had sworn he would not let her die. Celira's eyes filled with tears again. She imagined the scene, the broken streets, the soldiers, the fire, and a lone human carrying a child not his own. Her people would have walked away, too afraid to risk more loss. But this stranger had chosen to protect. Her voice trembled. "You did not know she was mine," she whispered. "You did not know if anyone cared for her." The human nodded slowly. "I did not need to know," he answered. "She needed someone, so I stayed." The words echoed in her chest. Her people spoke of survival, of silence, of hiding from pain. But this human spoke of something different. Not survival, but responsibility. Not silence, but defiance. It was madness, it was dangerous. Yet it was also beautiful. The baby stirred, letting out a small cry, and Celira rocked her gently. The sound was like sunlight breaking through endless clouds. Her lullaby rose again, softer this time, filled not only with sorrow but with warmth. The human listened, his head tilted, his eyes reflecting the light of the lamp. When she finished, he spoke again, his tone quieter. "My people say a child is hope," he said, "and hope must be protected, no matter the cost." Celira's breath caught. Hope. Her people had buried hope long ago, fearing its sharp edge, fearing its weight. But this fragile creature sitting in her room carried hope as if it were his weapon. And he had fought with it against monsters greater than himself. Her claws curled against the cradle, her chest tight with emotion. Perhaps this was why the galaxy feared humans. Not because of their strength, but because of their refusal to let go. Still, doubt stirred within her. Her people distrusted outsiders, feared betrayal. She looked at him carefully, her voice sharp though her heart softened. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Will you take her again? Will you bring more danger to my home?" The human shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "No," he said firmly. "She is yours. She belongs with you. I only wanted to return what was stolen." Silence filled the chamber once more. But this silence was not heavy like before. It carried something different. Celira studied him, this strange being who looked fragile but spoke like stone. His hands bore scars, his armor was damaged, yet his eyes burned with quiet fire. He had carried her daughter back into her arms when no one else would, and though he was not Cathari, though he was not kin, he felt closer in spirit than many of her own people. She whispered softly, almost to herself. My people will not understand. They will say I am cursed, that I trusted a stranger. The human's voice was calm, steady. Then let them say what they will, he answered. Your daughter is alive and nothing else matters. Solara held her child tighter, her tears falling again. Her voice cracked as she murmured, You gave me back my life. The human did not answer, he only bowed his head, as if the weight of his journey finally pressed down on him. For a moment, she thought he might fall asleep right there against the wall, and she realized how much he had given, how much he had risked to bring her daughter home. The cradle stood beside them, no longer empty. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across the walls. Solara sang again, her voice stronger, carrying gratitude and love through every note. The human listened in silence, his eyes closing, his body finally at peace, and Solara thought to herself, perhaps the stories were true. Perhaps humans were not weak, not reckless, but something else entirely, something the galaxy had forgotten, something her people needed to remember. The night stretched long, but Solara did not sleep. Her daughter lay in her arms, warm and breathing, her tiny fingers curling around her mother's silver-marked skin. The human rested nearby, his back against the wall, his body slumped with exhaustion. The lamp flickered, shadows rising and falling across his worn armor. For the first time in many cycles, the chamber no longer felt empty, it felt alive. Solara's heart was still torn between fear and wonder. This human was a stranger, a being from a world she had never seen, yet he had carried her daughter when her own people had turned away. She looked at his hands, scarred and raw, the hands that had dug through fire and stone, and she thought to herself, such hands should not belong to something fragile. When dawn arrived, the human stirred. His eyes opened slowly, heavy with weariness, yet sharp. When they found the cradle, he looked at the child first. Then at Solara. Is she safe? He asked, his voice rough. Solara nodded, her voice soft. She is safe. Because of you. The human leaned his head back against the wall, relief crossing his face. For a moment, silence settled again. But it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of two beings who had faced storms and were still breathing. Solara finally asked the question that had burned inside her all night. Why did you come here to our city? To me? He looked at her for a long time, his gaze steady. I had nowhere else to go, he said simply. The Therics hunted me when I escaped with her. They would have killed us both. So I searched for her people, for her home, and I found you. His words struck deep. He had not only saved her daughter, he had risked his own life to return her. Solara could not understand. No Cathari would have done such a thing. Yet this human had. Over the following days, he remained. Not because she asked, but because he chose to. He helped gather food, carrying heavier loads than most. He repaired the broken door of her chamber, his hands skilled despite their roughness. He stood watch when night fell, his strange weapon close at hand, and Solara realized something she had not felt in cycles. She felt safe. Her people noticed. They whispered when they saw the human walking beside her, carrying baskets from the market. Some called her foolish, others accused her of betrayal. But there were those whose eyes softened. They saw the way the child laughed in her mother's arms, the way Solara's song no longer shook with only sorrow. The human's presence unsettled them, but it also stirred something, a reminder of what they had once been. One evening, Solara sang again. Her daughter slept peacefully in the cradle that was no longer empty. The human sat nearby, silent, listening. When the song ended, he spoke softly. In my world, mothers sing too, he said. They sing to remind children they are loved, even when the world is harsh. Solara's eyes filled with tears. Her voice whispered, our songs were once like that too, but now they are mostly for grief. The human's gaze was steady. Then sing for hope again, he said. The words planted roots inside her. She began to sing not only for her child, but for her people. Her voice carried through the streets at night, and those who once mocked her now paused to listen, even if they would not admit it. Her song gave them something they had long buried, a taste of hope. The bond between Solara and the human grew slowly. Carefully, at first it was silence shared across the room. Then it was words, short and simple. Stories of his world, of blue oceans and green fields, of skies without violet storms. Stories of her world, of crystal spires and ancient songs. Their words bridged the gap between them. Their bond was not built on trust alone. But on sacrifice she had lost everything, and he had carried it back to her. But danger was never far one night. The sound of engines filled the skies. The black warships of the Therics loomed above, their shadows darkening the city. Fear swept through the streets. Families hiding, guards powerless. Celira held her child close, terror clawing at her heart. The human stood at the door, his weapon ready. He did not look afraid, only determined. "If they come, I will stand," he said. His voice was calm, steady like stone. Celira stared at him, her heart racing. This fragile being, smaller than her people, dared to fight the monsters they all feared. The warships passed without striking that night, leaving only silence and trembling hearts. But Celira had seen the truth. The human's fire was real. It was not in his strength, not in his weapons, but in his refusal to bow. Her people had forgotten how to stand, but this stranger had not. And in that moment she realized something. Perhaps the cradle was not the only thing he had returned. Perhaps he had also returned to her people what they had lost. As she watched him guard the door, her child sleeping peacefully, Celira whispered softly to herself, "Humans are not weak." Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying into the night. "They are what we have forgotten." The days that followed were not peaceful. The shadow of the Therics still loomed above the skies, their warships drifting like vultures waiting to strike. But something inside the city of the Cathari had begun to change. It started with whispers, then with quiet songs, and slowly with voices that dared to speak louder than fear. Celira noticed it first when she walked through the market. The people who once avoided her now paused to greet her. Mothers who had lost children came to hear her song, their eyes filled with tears and longing. Fathers looked at the human with both suspicion and curiosity. Children laughed when he passed, reaching for his strange hands. And for the first time in many cycles, the air of the city carried more than sorrow. It carried questions, it carried hope. The human remained by Celira's side. He never asked for thanks, never asked for reward. He lived simply, fixing doors, carrying heavy loads, standing guard at night. Yet his presence was heavier than any army, because he was proof that courage was not gone, proof that sacrifice was still possible, proof that even the smallest flame could push back endless dark. One evening, Celira sang again in the square. Her voice rose stronger than ever before, not only for her daughter but for every empty cradle in the city. The people gathered, listening, their eyes glistening in the firelight. The human stood nearby, silent, his weapon resting against his leg. He did not need to speak, his very presence was a story. And when Celira's song ended, the silence that followed was not hollow. It was filled with something sharp and bright, the sound of hope returning. But hope is dangerous, and the Therics felt it within days. Their warships descended again. Soldiers poured into the streets, armored giants with burning eyes. The people screamed, running for shelter, their old fear rising like smoke. Yet Celira did not run. She clutched her child and stood at her door, her heart pounding. The human stepped forward, placing himself between her and the enemy. The clash was brief but fierce. The human fought with fire in his eyes, moving with speed born not of strength but of will. Every strike, every shot carried defiance. The Therics roared, mocking him as fragile, but they bled under his hands, and when it seemed he would fall, the sound of Celira's voice rose again. She sang not for sorrow but for strength. Her song echoed through the streets, reaching the ears of her people. And for the first time in many generations, the Cathari remembered. They remembered who they had been. The people rose, mothers, fathers, elders, even children. Voices joined Celira's song. The melody turned into a roar, not of despair but of unity. The Therics faltered, unnerved by the fire they had not seen in so long. The human fought on, but now he was not alone. The Cathari stood with him. Stones became weapons, broken tools became blades, and together they pushed the invaders back. It was not victory, but it was not surrender. It was a beginning. When the soldiers retreated, leaving smoke and silence, the people gathered in the square. Celira held her daughter high, her voice steady. She was taken, but returned, she declared, by one who was not of our blood. The crowd listened, their eyes wide. This human risked everything for a child who was not his own, she continued. He reminded us of what we had forgotten. Her voice broke, but her fire did not. We are not weak if we stand. We are not broken if we fight. We are not lost if we protect each other. The people roared, their voices echoing across the city. For the first time in many cycles, the crystal spires glowed brighter. As if the planet itself heard their defiance, the human stood silent, his chest heaving, his weapon lowered. He did not seek their praise, he did not call himself savior. But in every heart that beat that night, his name was etched human in the weeks that followed. Celira's song became more than a mother's lullaby. It became a call, a symbol, a spark. Her people sang with her, their voices rising into the night sky. The Tharic still threatened. But fear no longer chained the Cathari, because one fragile being had reminded them that strength is not in the body. It is in the heart. Celira sat by the cradle one evening, her daughter sleeping peacefully. The human sat across from her. Repairing a piece of armor with steady hands, she looked at him and whispered, "You gave me back more than my child." He lifted his head, his eyes calm, his voice simple. "I only did what had to be done." But Celira shook her head, her silver markings glowing faintly in the lamplight. "No," she said, "you gave us back ourselves." Outside, the people sang together, their voices strong. The cradle rocked gently, no longer empty. The city breathed with new life. And though the Tharic still hovered in the dark, the fire of defiance had returned. It would not be extinguished again. Celira kissed her daughter's forehead, her voice soft but firm. "They call them fragile. They call them weak," she murmured. "But when the world turned its back, a human stood, and because of him we remember who we are."